On a quiet evening in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the kind that settles like linen over the city's colonial bones, a man in a white shirt stood unlocking the front door of his own home. It was the kind of gesture repeated across neighborhoods 1,000 times a night, routine, invisible, until it wasn't. The screech of tires broke the stillness. A patrol car halted mid-street, headlights flooding the man's porch. Then a voice, sharp and commanding, "Step away from the door." No greeting, no clarification. Within seconds, he was face down on his own front steps, wrists cinched tight in metal. The man's name was Professor Malcolm Monroe, but that didn't matter yet. A neighbor's phone rose shakily into the air, recording. Someone's voice cracked the air. "That's Professor Monroe. He teaches constitutional law at Harvard." The officers didn't flinch. To them, he was just a suspicious black man forcing a door. No alarm had sounded. No call for help came from within. What prompted this wrongful arrest was a passing stranger's assumption and an officer's split-second judgment, all too common trigger in the pattern of racial profiling. Professor Monroe did not resist. He didn't shout. He counted. He thought of his father, pulled over in Alabama in 1968 for fitting a description. He thought of his students at Harvard Law, the ones who believed the Constitution was something more than paper. And he thought, with icy clarity, that his balcony camera, always on, was catching every second. The officers didn't ask his name. They didn't check his ID. What they did not know was that the man they had just handcuffed on his own doorstep was not only a tenured professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, but a federal advisor on civil rights law, man who had testified before Congress on the limits of police authority. The arrest was not just an error. It was a textbook case of systemic injustice, caught on camera, unfolding in real time. Inside the patrol car, Monroe said nothing, but his silence wasn't passive. It was gathering. It was building weight. And in a city already on edge from past scandals, the fallout of this civil rights violation would travel farther than any of those officers could imagine. The footage, both from the neighbor's phone and Monroe's own surveillance video, was about to go viral. The moment would become not just a local scandal, but a national reckoning. And before the week was over, it would trigger a Department of Justice investigation into patterns of abuse in the Cambridge Police Department. Justice, some would say, had finally found a witness. But what came next would test not only a man's dignity but a system's willingness to be held accountable. Malcolm Monroe had returned home late that night from a week-long legal symposium in D.C., his carry-on still in hand, his shirt pressed but rumpled from travel. The front door lock, a century-old relic on a brownstone porch, had jammed, as it often did after a dry summer. He muttered something about needing to replace it, jiggled the key, and leaned into the frame with practiced patience. What he didn't know was that across the street, a visitor, unfamiliar with the neighborhood, had dialed 911 to report a possible break-in. The caller didn't recognize him, but every neighbor did. Monroe had lived on that street for over 15 years. He hosted book clubs, mentored first-gen students, coached mock trials at the local high school. None of that mattered when two officers arrived. They didn't ask questions. They didn't verify anything. They shouted orders. And when Monroe attempted to explain calmly, clearly they cut him off, forced his hands behind his back, and placed him under arrest. At the precinct, he was not booked. He was not read his Miranda rights. He was not offered a phone call. For nearly 2 hours, he sat in silence while officers ran background checks that came back clean. No probable cause, no explanation, just tension and delay. In that room, Monroe wasn't a professor or an advisor to the federal judiciary. He was just another black man in a holding cell, held, not for a crime, but for looking like one might have been committed. But Monroe was not just waiting. He was observing. He watched their posture, listened to their tone. He logged the timeline. He noted that when he asked, "Am I being charged?" the answer shifted from silence to condescension. He asked for badge numbers. He received smirks. What the officers didn't know was that Monroe had spent 2 decades teaching Harvard students how to argue Fourth Amendment violations in court, and what they were doing right then was textbook unlawful detainment. This wasn't about one arrest. It was about a pattern, a system of behavior where suspicion follows skin tone and authority acts before it asks. Monroe, even while restrained, knew exactly what was happening, and he knew how to prove it. He didn't shout or beg. He waited. Outside the station, the video had already started spreading. The neighbor's post had crossed 100,000 views in just under 3 hours. The caption read, "Harvard professor arrested on his own porch. No apology, no explanation." The hashtags told the rest: wrongful arrest, police accountability, racial profiling. What began as a routine patrol call was about to escalate into a national headline, because Monroe wasn't going to let this moment pass in silence. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about all the others who never got the chance to prove they belonged. When Professor Monroe was released, there was no apology, no report, no trace of what had just occurred, except the silence of the officers and the fire beginning to rise online. But Monroe knew what to ask for. The next morning, he filed a formal request for the body cam footage. What he received confirmed the worst. The cameras were turned off during the moment of arrest. All of them. It was a violation of department policy, of public trust, and of federal guidelines designed to protect against abuse. And it was not an accident. Meanwhile, the video captured by his neighbor Talia Nguyen, a freelance journalist and Monroe's former student, had exploded across social media. She had captioned it simply, "This is Professor Monroe, this is America." The clip was under 40 seconds, but it was enough. Monroe being pinned against the wall of his own home, the shouted orders, the disbelief in a bystander's voice. Within hours, major outlets picked it up. It was no longer just a viral surveillance video, it was a symbol. And as the footage spread, so did the outrage. Hashtags like DOJ investigation and civil rights violation trended overnight. The Cambridge Police Department responded with a single sentence: "Officers acted within protocol." That sentence sparked a second wave of public anger. Monroe.com, as ever, filed a formal petition to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, not just for himself, but for something larger. He asked for a federal investigation into pattern and practice violations by the department, and the DOJ listened. What they found unraveled quickly. The officer who arrested Monroe, Darren Kelton, had 7 prior complaints involving Black and Latino residents. None had led to discipline. 3 had included formal complaints, documented, then quietly buried by his superior, Captain Raymond Keene. When DOJ agents began their interviews, more stories emerged. Not all were recorded, but the patterns were clear. Traffic stops without cause, excessive force during routine calls, and always the same communities targeted. The internal shield that had kept Kelton safe began to crack. And then came the breaking point. Monroe's legal team discovered that 2 of the hidden complaints involved minors, both stopped and searched without parental notice, both dismissed without written record. These findings added fuel to the DOJ's case. It wasn't just an individual act anymore, it was a culture, and cultures don't change unless someone breaks the silence. Harvard too responded. A press conference was held on the steps of the law school. Faculty, alumni, civil rights advocates gathered behind Monroe as he stepped to the podium. But he didn't speak long. He let others do that. Students, professors, and even former judges voiced their anger, their support, their demand for structural change. Tens of thousands signed petitions calling for transparency. The city government, once silent, began to feel the pressure. And when the Department of Justice confirmed a formal federal civil rights probe, it was clear this wasn't going away quietly. What started with a lock that wouldn't turn had now become a national referendum on power, race, and the choices police departments make when they think no one is watching. Professor Monroe didn't sue for money. When the city of Cambridge offered a substantial civil settlement to resolve the wrongful arrest, he declined any personal payout. Instead, he asked that the funds be directed to a public truster, new legal fellowship named after his late mother, the Adrian Monroe Fellowship, designed to support students of color pursuing careers in constitutional and civil rights law. His message was simple: if you want justice to mean something, invest in the people who will protect it. The DOJ's findings were swift and direct. Officer Darren Kelton was charged under federal law for civil rights violations under color of law, rare but powerful statute meant to address abuse by public officials. Kelton's record was undeniable. The testimony from other victims, combined with suppressed complaints and Monroe's own footage, built a case too strong to ignore. In a quiet courtroom, surrounded by federal prosecutors, Kelton accepted a plea deal: 1 year of probation, 6 months of public service, loss of his pension, and permanent decertification as a law enforcement officer. He would never wear a badge again. But the reckoning didn't stop there. Captain Keane, the man who had signed off on every buried complaint, resigned 2 days before a scheduled deposition. The city released a statement citing personal reasons, but the public knew better. Investigative journalists uncovered emails suggesting a years-long effort to suppress misconduct records and avoid civilian review. The city council, under pressure, passed an emergency motion to establish an independent police oversight committee. It was called the Monroe Protocol, local reform born from national scrutiny. Then came the moment people didn't expect. Monroe and Kelton faced out. It happened in the courthouse hallway after sentencing. Kelton looked older than his years, uniform gone, eyes lowered. Monroe walked past him, paused, and spoke not with rage, but with gravity. "I've spent 3 decades teaching the law," he said. He spent 15 years ignoring it. Kelton didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence hung heavier than any sentence. That single exchange circulated online faster than the original arrest video. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. Here was a man who had been humiliated, reduced, handcuffed on his own doorstep, choosing not vengeance, but clarity. He didn't need to raise his voice. The system had finally listened. City officials announced new policies requiring monthly body cam audits, expanded civilian oversight, and mandatory bias training for all officers. These reforms weren't perfect, but they were real. And more than that, they were public. The days of hiding misconduct behind closed doors were over. For many, this case became more than a headline. It was proof that change delayed, denied, resisted was still possible when truth was made visible. And someone refused to stay silent. 1 year later, the auditorium at Harvard was filled to capacity. Students, faculty, and visitors from across the country gathered for the inaugural ceremony of the Adrienne Monroe Fellowship. The atmosphere was electric, not with noise, but with meaning. On stage, young scholars from underrepresented communities stood poised to carry forward what Monroe had begun. They weren't chosen for sympathy. They were chosen for vision, for resilience, and for the future they promised to build in courtrooms and classrooms across America. One student stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady, her eyes bright. "I used to think the law didn't see people like me," she said. "Now I'm learning it to defend those who still don't have a voice." Her words weren't dramatic, they were deliberate, and they hit harder than any verdict. It wasn't just about police accountability anymore, it was about legacy, about planting something stronger than a headline. Among the attendees sat a young man in a crisp gray uniform, the first black recruit to graduate from the newly reformed Cambridge Police Academy in nearly a decade. He had been inspired by Monroe's story and funded through the fellowship. As he took his oath to protect and serve, he added his own quiet vow to uphold not just order but dignity. Professor Monroe watched from the front row, his academic robes folded neatly on his lap. When the applause swelled, he stood, not to speak, but to bear witness. The sun filtered through the high windows, casting a warm glow on his face. He had been at the center of a viral civil rights violation that shook the city. Now, he was at the edge of something better. In the closing moments, a voice narrated softly over images of students studying late, communities organizing, courtrooms filled with purpose. What happened to him wasn't rare, but what he chose to do with it, that's what made change possible. Real justice doesn't need noise. It needs choices. Deliberate, difficult, human choices. The final frame faded in slowly white text on black. Justice is a choice. Silence is too. Then, one last line lingered. Injustice doesn't begin with sirens. It begins when good people look away. The story ended not with punishment, but with purpose. A reminder to everyone watching. Justice isn't what the system allows. It's what we demand of ourselves.